Gemma. Unlike Pat, who promised you no data, I'm going to promise you an abundance of data, so hold on tight. Today I'm going to endeavour to take you on a whistle-stop tour of hotel performance around the globe in its entirety. So let's get started. I've heard the word soft landing a few times over the last kind of 7 to 10 days. And we're certainly starting to coin that word as well, especially when it comes to global demand. We had been using the word deceleration, but I think soft landing is more representative of what's happening with demand. So to be clear, it is not declining. Demand is still increasing, and it's increasing more rapidly in some locations than others. Here is one of those where it's more than others. More on that in a moment. So more recently, we're seeing demand increase by about 1 to 2%. As you can see here from a global standpoint. And it's really only slowed down in the last 6 months. So we have pretty robust increases, some of those still recovering from COVID, Pat mentioned, especially in the Asia and particularly the China market. So if we look at what that means for average rate, and there's one thing I just want to caveat here before I deep dive too much into average rate. When you look at the Middle East and Africa combined, it's a little unfair. Because when you strip out Africa from the performance, the numbers that you would see here are in positive territory. So Africa bringing that down, and certainly when you strip out the GCC, a much more positive picture to date. So all things are not equal when it comes to the average rate side of things. Average rate, however, is still going and growing is how we've been coining it. With that said, growth rates have slowed relative to last year, so still growing, but at a slower pace than what we've seen in previous years. And generally speaking, they're keeping kind of in line with what we're seeing regarding inflation around the world. So certainly average rate still on the up. And there's that interplay with average rate. So whilst we still continue to see occupancy grow for the most part, that tends to help average rate continue to grow as well, although we are seeing that occupancy softening. Now, if you look at it on a slightly different view, the various different continents, some have been on more roller coasters than others. And I think that kind of identifies quite clearly what I said about occupancy. So when you're still seeing occupancy grow or even flatten or even decline maybe 1-2%, there's still some room to push average rate. It's when you start seeing average rate decline into those 3, 4, 5%, occupancy decline that you see average rate follow suit. So still mostly positive around the world. Speaking of around the world, for the first 8 months for occupancy, it's a pretty positive picture, and mostly one of growth. Europe leads the way, believe it or not, with 69% of all rooms sold in the first 8 months, which is about a 1% increase on last year, the previous 8 months. You'll see there the Middle East growing by 3%, and again, in or around that 2/3 of all rooms sold. Over in North America, led principally by the US, we are seeing flat growth, so pretty much the exact same occupancy this year as we've seen in the 8 months to last year. More on US in just a moment. Average rate is growing, albeit at what we're describing now as a normalised rate. So it's got that kind of 2, 3, 4, maybe in some cases 5% lift year over year, but certainly back to a pattern that we experienced pre-COVID, so the more normalised rate. And 2024 really being the first year that we've had normalised performance. Remember, 2023, we still had that reflection, especially in Q1, back to Q1 of 2022. So this is the first kind of normal year that we've seen post-COVID. So what are some of the global demand drivers that we're seeing? I'm going to start with 2 in particular. One is the phenomenon that is Taylor Swift. The Eras Tour, I think you'll agree, was pretty spectacular. Now, whilst the Eras Tour did not come to this part of the world, it certainly did take many other parts of the world by storm. And you'll see the smaller markets, the markets with limited supply, actually performed better than those with significant supply. It would be remiss of me to stand on stage today and to not talk about Coldplay. Now, Jonathan showed you in his opening address yesterday some of the aerial views of the concerts that Coldplay have played around the world. And I can tell you, hot off the press, Abu Dhabi has seen a 110% increase in demand over the Coldplay dates. So let's hope they announce more than the 4 nights. So the Musicospheres tour, when it comes to Abu Dhabi, I would expect you can see very, very similar increases particularly on the average rate side of things, which is what we've seen in the other locations around the world for Coldplay. And of course, 10 nights coming up in Wembley. So let's go on a global tour of other demand drivers. Anecdotally, people talk about when it's an election year in the US that outbound travel decreases. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. You'll see a number of different locations where outbound US travellers sit in the top 5 outbound traveller incoming to these various different locations. So whether it's Toronto, Amsterdam, London, Rome, and Paris, of course, for 2024, is Olympic driven. TSA has never experienced higher outbound travel numbers. So it doesn't really slow down travel outbound from the US. Now, speaking of elections, and Pat spoke about this a little bit, but if we look back at historical performance during an election year, the impact, at least US-wide, is limited. Of course, the impact on Washington, D.C., especially in election month, is pretty significant. An average rate in previous years has increased by between 50 and 65% during that election month. But generally speaking, across the US, there's not a massive impact on hotel performance, at least. Now, if we look at that from a slightly different view, what you're seeing here is the on the books as at the 16th of September for the top 25 US markets. So you're seeing 2024, the bar charts, and then what we've seen on the books in 2023. And the impact is so little today that we actually had to point out what date you're seeing the election falling on. So very, very similar occupancy on the books into the future as we've seen in 2023. So if we hop across to Europe and look at where Europe is sitting in the world map, and our super smart analysts analysed a lot of data to come up with this analogy. So what you're seeing here is the occupancy by week for Europe in 2018. So okay, we had some peaks, some troughs, some event-driven demand, some maybe events that had been in the various European markets the previous year and then didn't repeat the following year. But look what happens when you overlay 2024, albeit the first 8 months. Who said you can't forecast European hotel performance, at least occupancy? Like I said, thanks to our super smart analysts. And they've found a pattern. And the pattern is that every 6 years, it more or less repeats itself. So 2024, reflecting back to 2018. So the sentiment being that 2025 will reflect back to 2019. And then, of course, we will hit a bump in the road with COVID comparisons not being comparable going forward. So it is a highly predictable pattern for occupancy across Europe. Now, how does that play out with average rate? So whilst occupancy is somewhat predictable, average rate, sadly, is not. And we are starting to see a greater price sensitivity across the European market. So occupancy has been pretty modestly growing since April, and rates, though, are still moving. And that big uplift that you see towards the end of the sequence for average rate is Paris pushing European performance during the Olympic period. And I'll show you a little bit more detail on that in just a moment. So the big driving force, Paris is one of those. Paris RevPAR increased just shy of 200% during the Olympic period. And to put that into real terms, that number was €773 average rate and 85% occupancy. So really strong performance in the Paris market. However, if you were to look at Paris year to date for the 8 months, Paris actually declined occupancy by 3% and grew average rate by 6%. So a net kind of dirty maths of 3% increase in RevPAR. So we did see, as happens in many other locations that host Olympics or World Cup or big world stage events, we did see that displacement effect, whether it was for corporates or other leisure demand that would ordinarily enter into the Paris market. Now, if we look at the Euros, I, for one, living in London, was pretty tired of hearing it's coming home. And alas, it did not come home. England did get to the final of the Euros, and being Irish, I was quite happy that Spain won, so sorry, England. But you'll certainly see the impact of how it played out in Berlin, especially when the final game took place towards the middle of July. Now, if you looked at some of the locations outside of Berlin that hosted some of the games, again, some of the smaller markets were those that actually had the greatest impact. Dortmund, for example, a 175% lift in average rate. So relatively small amount of supply in the market by comparison to Berlin or Frankfurt or Hamburg or some of the larger counterparts. Whereas average rate in Berlin ranged from 5 to about 30%, with the exception, of course, of the night of the Spain-England final. Now let's just look at Taylor Swift around Europe. The bigger the bubble, the greater the amount of supply in the location. And you'll see on the horizontal axis is the ADR growth, on the vertical is the occupancy growth. All locations benefited from the Eras Tour, regardless of where Taylor Swift descended. Adele, not to forget about Adele, certainly had a big impact in the Munich market. So she had a very small, we're calling kind of a mini residency. And the rumour that average rate was going to grow was certainly more than a rumour, with a 108% increase in rate during the Adele concerts. So over 2/3 of the RevPAR was on the back of rate. Now, what goes up mostly has to come back down. And you'll see this is what we're forecasting for Paris, Munich, London, and Dusseldorf into the future. So you'll see Paris, unsurprisingly, we're expecting a decline in average rate and to actually recoup that occupancy decline that we've seen as we've seen that displacement take hold. London, for at least August next year today, although things change quite quickly, as you all know, we're looking at a relatively weak August, weak in terms of events coming in to backfill some of that concert demand, although Oasis is not reflected in these numbers as they announced their concerts after we'd done this August forecast. And then you're seeing some growth over Dusseldorf as they hold the Universidad Games as well. So let's bring things home to the GCC before we move over to Asia. And this is something that maybe a handful of you have seen from last week. And it's just to show the sheer growth across the GCC. There is no other region in the world that has grown at even a similar pace to what we've seen in the GCC. It's been pretty phenomenal. Now, it's a decade-long series that you're seeing here. But if I was to take you back 2 decades and to 20 years ago, and maybe some of you were here 20 years ago, you would reflect this as being a 117% increase in supply. Over the decade-long series that you're seeing here, a 42.2% increase in supply. So a really significant increase. And a lot of that, not all of course, but a lot, the two bigger contributing economies to that increase is Saudi Arabia and of course right where we all are today in the UAE. From a compound annual growth rate, that's a 4.2% increase every year over the last 20 years. So if we look at where some of that supply is entering the market, and this is just for the 8 months of 2024, Muscat tops the table, a 9.5% increase in supply in the first 8 months of this year. Mecca in second position, 6.1, Al-Khobar 4.1, and Jeddah just under the 4% mark, so 3.9%. Many of the giga projects, of course, contributing, especially in the Saudi market, to this performance and growth. You'll see some declines then as well on the far right-hand side, and some of those closures of assets is down to either refurbishment or maybe even repositioning of those assets as new projects are announced. The effect on occupancy, we have certainly identified a change in occupancy over the GCC. So the lighter green line, the 12 months, the darker green line, the first 8 months. So across the GCC, occupancy tends to sit somewhere between the kind of 65 and 70% mark, which is still really, really robust occupancy. And candidly, if the amount of new supply that's come into this region in the last even 5 years had happened anywhere else in the world, the impact on occupancy would be much more significant. So it certainly does play into the concept of build it and they will come. It is all about demand for this region, though. The lighter purple, what we seen a decade ago, the darker, the cap and growth that we continue to see and expect to see into the future for the GCC. So really, really strong performance across the market. If we look at just a couple of the contributing events happening, looking here, of course, at Formula One, eye-watering average rate. Whether you're looking at Abu Dhabi or Jeddah, obviously Abu Dhabi 2024, not for another 6 or 8 weeks' time, Bahrain almost pales in comparison, but that is 35.5%. It's just because the other two are so significant. Abu Dhabi, obviously, from last year, and Jeddah from earlier this year. So Bahrain, Jeddah, 194% by comparison to Abu Dhabi's 238. And you'll see here, mostly average rate. If we look then at the future performance, the line that you see running through the sequence here is last year on the books and the tower blocks on the books this year. So ADIPEC moving, and Formula One, purely by virtue of it being a much more exciting race and not a foregone conclusion, as it has been in the last couple of years, as to who will take pole position in Abu Dhabi. So much more exciting, and hence demand much more exciting. Let me take you through Asia Pacific very briefly. And it is a normalization. We're seeing that divergence across Asia Pacific. So Asia Pacific, Pat mentioned this, especially for China, the last world region to recover post-COVID, the last region to recover full airlift, and tourism numbers still on the recovery path. All things are not equal in Asia Pacific. It's obviously a huge region, but we can bucket the various different impacts that we're seeing, whether it's FX in Tokyo, so seeing really strong demand going into Tokyo, very good value for return on exchange rate, especially for the US and Europe. There's pricing power in Jakarta and Mumbai, so domestic demand is really strong. And Sydney and Bangkok are those two markets that can always be counted on for stability, so seeing pretty significant stability coming in. And then Auckland and the New Zealand market, sadly, in recession and impact being seen there as well. The love story continued in Asia Pacific with Taylor Swift. Certainly Melbourne was the first market that some of you may have seen that we did an analysis on, and you'll see the heady heights of average rate in the Melbourne market. And this is sequenced right through for 12 months from February 2023 right up to the 9th of February 2024. And then the pickup. The pink line's the actualized number, and the yellow, the date basically the announcement was made of where some of those concerts would take place. So pickup is immediate. It's instantaneous when you have those big events coming in. And then just on the Formula One, left-hand side is Formula One in Melbourne, right-hand side is Taylor Swift. Formula One generated a 413%, yes, 413% increase in average rate. Taylor Swift, 415% increase in average rate. So the message there is you need a Formula One or a Taylor Swift to get into the 400% plus of average rate increase. And then finally, just to show you a little insight into our forecast around the world, and for the eagle eyes of you, you'll see that Dubai and Abu Dhabi is there in the middle, and we have just started forecasting for Jeddah and Riyadh also. So events have played a huge part in driving demand globally in 2024, and some of those offsets on the far right-hand side will be on the back of those events not repeating this year, and the hope and expectation in those locations that maybe something else will come in to fill that gap. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.